I just want to return and continue to the last point that I was speaking to about getting into some stuff that I guess you could vaguely summarize as the battle of the sexes in the current political climate and the general ideological landscape. Going to draw on some things that Peter Thiel, or it's Thiel, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, said in a debate quite a long time ago. I saw a nice YouTube video where it was even commented that he prophetically seemed to predict quite a lot of how this slave morality got off the ground, although he doesn't describe it as such, and he's quite detailed over the things that he's tracing and how they will likely manifest, and the kind of how they set up their argument, which is how the social justice movement or the he was focusing on political correctness, but he first started on debunking the kind of conglomerate set of issues under so-called multiculturalism, which is not really interested in cultures. It's just essentially anti-Western values and anti-West and anti-white. It's got this. He points out that it's even sometimes characterized as being relativistic, but it isn't really relativistic in terms of it's relativistic about anything that isn't Western and everything that isn't white. But it's a very sort of strange mishmash, and it has to perpetrate that level of inconsistency just to kind of stabilize itself, essentially, to set up the kind of the different rules that allows it to target and have a sort of a sustainable narcissistic supply that it can draw from and parasitize ideologically. Anyway, I wanted to kind of break down that issue further, but but it does all start with so-called feminism. And just as the Nazi machine really started with pandering to women as well, the Nuremberg rallies, women were a big element of the progressive political movement that was the kind of the vanguard of the Nazis, and obviously generally they were considered useful idiots, imagining liberation in so many different forms and possibilities. And then obviously the traditional fascistic solution at the end somewhat betrays them. But it's not that hard to see that it's built into the ideology itself that is inevitable, because the kind of political guardianship which they demand and they expect that their kind of environment must provide this kind of social justice. It's a form of paternalism that they're invoking. And they are expecting, that the kind of salvation which they describe requires a kind of cultural police force that is almost politically, that is alloyed with some political machinery. It is a kind of a cultural call for some form of enlightened authoritarianism, essentially. And obviously the level at which authoritarianism can't deliver an enlightened, it can superficially claim to be enlightened, but it will never deliver anything other than essentially corruption and scapegoating. But so just as so it empowers women by arming them with complaints, and specifically the complaint of being unsafe because of the success of others, so long as that success is condensed into a superficial morality of group membership. Okay, so yeah, so the superficial morality of group membership, that's basically my way of describing identity politics in general. And so within that identity politics, so I mean, success would be considered something like privilege when they go on about privilege. And what the argument, therefore, against privilege is that any competitive or arduous activity can be opted out of with this complaint of being unsafe. And social safeness, which then gets kind of labeled social justice, converges in the call for political guardianship and a cultural police force, which is essentially the Führer principle. I was going to say that in general, the reason why there is an appetite and why this ideology latches on so naturally with a certain segment of the population is because 20% of the population are naturally attuned to this kind of psychological profile, and in some sense, the cluster B pathologies that are often talked about, like borderline and antisocial personality disorder and such, and narcissism and psychopathy and things like that. There's a social potential of this behavior, which is kind of shared as a kind of morality that usually is a kind of a system of social manipulation, which gets deployed as a kind of I mean, you can see this in history as the kind of the morality that has festered around groups like the KKK, for instance. And the point of this is that it empowers certain people to operate and function naturally according to their personality style, because their personality style requires them essentially to be sadistic. And so you need a way to channel that sadism towards some target that it's safe to essentially generate some prejudice, and so most societies have learned to feed that kind of perniciousness by having a kind of underclass, and then especially women who fall into this personality style or that quadrant, or have a certain personality style that is attuned to that kind of psychological operation. They can. In terms of, I'm trying to use my psychological insights to kind of give a sociological analysis of certain things that happen, perhaps as tendencies in history and culture. But yeah, so generally, women especially are more prone to acting out these kinds of personality profiles in a kind of, and they more often require some kind of cultural edifice that can satiate that, because otherwise they could be individually very dysfunctional if they don't have a kind of a safe target that they can direct their vitriol toward, So in some way, it's a way for a culture or a society to roughly speaking stabilize itself by kind of compromising with the segment of the population within their midst, that there's a kind of a general amenity or facility to kind of absorb this psychic energy, to call it that, or the psychological focus that is needed to internally sustain those people's general functioning. Now, the West has been better than most other societies at identifying those traits and suppressing them and debunking them. And it is very hard to fight against these kinds of psychological forces, because I mean, I have once even said, almost somewhat pessimistically, that the problem with trying to suppress this element is, and I mean, it's an ongoing problem, is that it will always manifest in any particular. If a group can coalesce around beta quadra values, that's what I'm calling these. The kinds of psychological profiles that do this kind of stuff. It's an approximate thing that I'm kind of borrowing from socionics, but the beta quadra personality grouping is roughly the intuitive feelers. These are the people that have this kind of sadistic a mechanism that they have to find something to entertain that particular predilection that they have. So if a group can form, and it can be about anything, but if there is space within the culture that does not specifically outlaw or culturally suppress the manifestation of a group that can champion beta quadra values, it will exist. So unless there is, let's say, some kind of cohesive cultural armistice, or some kind of general cultural understanding that has, in some sense, some kind of taboo, because it's funny, on some level you almost have to fight fire with fire, because unless you can almost find something that gets these people to turn on themselves and to kind of attack their own tendency, you do have to kind of get these people to have some kind of internal war with the culture itself, that they have to see that the culture is actually not fit for them, the culture, because they would essentially only be happy in a Nazi society. These sorts of people, they need an authoritarian groupthink that they can be a kind of field marshal around, that they can supply. They are the stereotypical Italian mafia. Where they are selling protection to people. That is the kind of trade that they want to be in with their own people. And or who they consider their own people to be, is they want to they are almost Machiavellian manipulators, and they can portray a whole range of feelings that they can, they even believe their own dramatization in some sense, that they use their own feelings and they use other people. And they contrive circumstances, essentially, so that they can vicariously understand things which they almost, on some level, already know, because that's how they were able to plan it out. But they essentially need to invoke real feelings in other people, so that they can kind of see their soul playing out, and as big as their web, their kind of emotional draw factor for getting people involved in their embroiled, and often they will I mean, there's a whole slew of kind of tactics which they're very, at a young age they learn how to manipulate. They essentially they're very gifted at remembering who saw what and who heard what, and being able to kind of compile confusions, and a kind of webs of intrigue, and weaving a tapestry of very sophisticated, just the right amount of conflation, so that they can be the victim of something, and then they can sort of field marshal other people to stand with them or stand up for them. Or they can portray themselves as some white knight as well, and so they're very good at letting situations develop in such a way as to make their speciality of intervention that makes their moral code applicable, and so it's always sort of instantiated in a kind of in a moral dogma. They are always leaning on some kind of rule of thumb. That's enough of me describing that small little aspect. It's probably getting a bit dry just going into that, but and so the problem with them essentially is that they set up superficial morality systems which eventually are not fit for purpose, because everyone sees that they act like thugs, and then they have these very simple triggering systems which allow them to get their sadistically edged vindication of some internal it's like, I think on some level it's like some form of trauma bonding, that they're trying to inflict some level of trauma that then allows them to kind of be at peace with some internal something that they've been imprinted with, or something like that, or anyway, I'm not going to go into the origin of the false ego, but anyway, this is a common enough phenomena. It's roughly 20% of all people roughly fall into these sorts of personality styles. And generally, they even know themselves on some level, on some subconscious level at least, how dishonest and deceitful their general, because they are afraid of it being uncovered, and they are trying, they are these eternal imposters essentially. And the more that they get kind of cultural hegemony and control within a society, and the more that they make their mechanics respected by other people, the more dysfunctional everything becomes, the more disorientated and delusional, that you kind of, the only way to sustain their hegemony is through a kind of group psychosis. And the horrible thing is that it happens through the medium of morality itself. And the kind of morality that they promulgate is wholly unsustainable. It's not even tenable in a conceptual way. It depends on a kind of ad hoc discretion, and it kind of violates the principle of the rule of law, essentially, that their rules are never certain, and they're not prospective. They have to kind of be there's always some kind of discretionary components in terms of how they are applied and how they are inconsistently applied, according to some sort of thumb-sucked thing. And the reason why it takes on those features is because that is the veil and the concealment of the sadistically edged drama which they love to spin, and obviously you can only get away with that if you can clothe it in some kind of superficial moral issue, and so they pretend to be incredibly sophisticated and intellectually just, that they are zealots for social justice, or whatever it's called. Um, you know, uh, anyway, I wanted to focus more on the gender thing first. So, uh, although it is historically somewhat linked to everything that I'm talking about, is that to have the level of dysfunction or disorientation, the general kind of disintegration of culture that you need in order for this kind of cultural hegemony to take place, is you have to fundamentally dehumanize people. And so, that's what identity politics essentially is that you just take on this kind of matrix of stereotypes, which you have to kind of know, and you have to almost displace interpersonal relationships and understanding what's going on with this kind of codex of group characteristics and features and history. So it kind of it all gets broken down into this sophisticated. It's almost like Nazi spiritualism. Like in terms of the epistemological roots of some group outcome. And so everything is sort of also judged on this thing that completely, intentions are completely rewoven into how the intention interfaces with that ideological filter and reduction of reality, and so intention gets completely obliterated in any kind of, so the and also how this happens on a fundamental level is the breakdown between gender relations or sex itself or sexual relations between men and women, between girls and boys, that there's a kind of a very strange kind of imposition and stricture, which is projected on to which really makes the business of life a kind of a political. It reduces common sense features and a kind of, because even if the political shit was all true or whatever, even if a large section of what they complain about had some kind of basis in something that was something that had to be understood, at the end of the day you have to get practical, you have to get pragmatic. Or you see, this is the thing, is that what they are essentially calling for is some intervening force that comes from the top down and that reorders everything and that like has some kind of stricture which, if it's followed, kind of creatively solves the problem. And so, there isn't quite that final solution to what the ultimate filtering system should be and that ultimate rule book should be. So until then, you just have to keep on listening to people complaining, and talking about how they feel unsafe by other people and how they are unsafe because of the residue of privilege that is causing them violence and aggression. Which obviously lends itself to a kind of hysterical self-hypnosis into keeping the idea that people belong to these group entities projected onto real events in present time. So you're kind of holographically superimposing this ideological and disembodied narrative onto the event, and you can only do that in that state of hysteria. And so, they've got this whole culture essentially of how they have to be triggered in order to incept you into that framework, and so when they're in a discourse, some people can find, they essentially have to find ways to shock you into it. So if you're listening to them, they will essentially do two things. They will insult you intrinsically. They will make like a heinous moral accusation against you, and then they will normalize that in the style of the discourse. And if you swallow that, or if you hook onto that, then they've incepted you, And so, in fact, they will not even discuss anything with you until you essentially agree to be incepted into that disembodied narrative of being the representative of the group, which you belong to, according to their I don't like repeating myself, so so I talk slightly about this general sense of disorientation. Now, we've gotten to this point by denigrating culture and by essentially disintegrating it, and eroding all the the values that gave us even the tools for general progress. We've destroyed non-racialism. Effectively, it's culturally it's heresy to this secular fascist religion now of social justice. I described something about its fragmented framework that is not really able to even keep itself in focus without it. You see, it can never draw up a complete indictment, because then it would have to kind of face its ineffectual ability to actually address anything. Because essentially all it is doing is empowering essentially narcissistic personalities and codependent personalities, which are essentially almost the other side of the coin of the narcissist. And so in some sense, the whole identity politics thing and the whole so-called progressive movement is something like the codependent, useful idiot that essentially is continually giving power to the narcissistic, overtly fascist body politic, which shares the same values, essentially. Now, in this state of disintegration of culture, what we were already heading here for some time, but now just to sustain the amount of freedom that fascistic and beta quadra values have within the culture and the cultural hegemony requires women to sustain this kind of affronted, complaining, undermining, and dehumanization of sexual matters, and the relation between gender relations in general. So they have to almost just sustain this level of onslaught just to keep the status quo, um, especially in the level at which culture is so denigrated and disintegrated, is that the only source of values in general, and I'm taking this as almost like as a sociological generalization, is going to come from men. And this is why I was trying to talk about the differences between men and women in the last video, in that it's not only going to come from men, but in general it's going to more so come from men, because men are more attuned to being independent thinkers, as it were, because evolutionarily they have been selected by pressures that they couldn't just go with the flow. And in fact, women have almost the opposite tendency, where they are very attuned to the cultural status quo and into kind of fitting in with whatever cultural values of status and security, because they have to be successful earlier on in life. Whereas men have to work out the formula for success quite forthrightly, because the chances are they're just essentially going to get genocided out of the gene pool, essentially, at a rate which is the male disposability, essentially, that is built into us biologically, forces men into a kind of and so, I mean, there are some unpleasant juxtapositions that one can draw about some of these ideological strains, which is that women can lean on these things because essentially they never pay the price. They are always regarded as valuable, whereas men have to both be capable of rocking the boat, because sometimes boats do sink when they are not being effectively managed. But then they also have to, if the boat is being effectively managed, they essentially should not be okay. You can kind of finish that horrible analogy anyway. In your own mind, it's not that important, I guess, but yeah. So as I've already said, that it is almost a shame, because the median woman is more intelligent than the median man, and especially if we live in a culture or a society that actually has real values in its culture, women attune themselves to that, and they can exemplify them, and then women really do shine out as almost being superior to a large extent. That there's a kind of a greater mass of decency in women, but that's only when you don't have a disintegrated culture. When you've got a culture that is effectively insane, then that tendency almost goes the other way. Let me just try and read some of my notes. But the cultural deterioration that we live in within the state of a failed culture, which is the first claim of the radical rhetoric, especially in the so-called feminist rhetoric, that completely disintegrates interpersonal relations between the sexes, so that only the crudest and most superficial issues of identity can be claimed and counterclaimed. Identity that is the reduction of life into group shared experience that are put into matrices of tropes to be managed by some ideological armchair. And then I guess I have to defend myself from that claim, or from that analysis. I, on the other hand, am not managing anything. I'm merely making observations, and I'm not even prescribing what people should do. I'm just, if you understand, if this resonates or if this makes sense, then be persuaded. That's my only form of management that I'm offering. I'm not insisting that politics do some grand sweeping policy, although I do have things to say about the law, but that's simply about it not being applied in a fashion that is consistent with our own current set of principles and obligations under the Constitution. But anyway, that's a different point. So the framework and the outline that they have to operate from is so instantly hollow and unsustainable. It has to set itself a perpetrator to dispose of. It has to place itself in the shadow of some grand narrative of evil and inherited injustice, so that it can blind itself to the real obstacles and to raising standards and making improvements, because a practical assessment of all options would remove the convenient and corrupt shortcuts which are easy to perpetrate on the back of a vague identity war that conceals both kinds of injustice packed into social justice. And those both kinds, I was going to say, in terms of including the elite in the downtrodden identity and including privilege is really stupid, because just the concept of privilege as an immoral feature of reality is just so obtuse and so nonsensical. I mean, it really is. It's ahistorical in its assessment. I mean, it makes a religion out of history, and in that sense, it is ahistorical. It also ends up converting history into a mythology, which creates a very strong bias and narrow interpretation, so as to suppress information and knowledge which doesn't conform to its implicit attitude of what it would consider heresy. And then very quickly you get into like the universities in Weimar Germany that were essentially the funnel of the fascist mentality, which is exactly what is happening in modern South Africa, at least, and in the universities and the intellectual atmosphere all over the place, which is creating the same kind of appeasement that Hitler got before the war. Hitler was very popular before the war. It's crazy how much history is repeating itself. I don't think I want to talk about nihilism. I wrote specific notes about the stabilizing effect of having an underclass and how that relates to women in particular. And how the kind of the general fascist formula ends up betraying them. Because women are, let's say, already more attuned to noticing kind of algorithmic exploitation of social levers. If they're not happy and stable, they have almost built within them natural tendencies to almost punish their environment for any instability that they themselves are experiencing. And in order to kind of lean on the assistance that might be available. You can see this even in the kind of social scandals that happen. It's very interesting with, I think Joe Biden is sort of in the middle of some kind of scandal at the moment. I mean, not making any kind of moral claim, but a lot of these women are really victims of their own lack of boundaries and just vocalize. They are too timid and scared, but to utter their and lay down their own boundaries, and even that language, you see, is you see how easy it is to fall into their particular ideological framework. These people are not scared. Essentially, they are scared of not being greedy. Essentially, they're afraid that if they lay down boundaries, what that would mean to their immediate sense of success, or at least their potential source of ongoing association and what benefits they might draw from that ongoing association. And so instead they fall back on a kind of reservoir of social manipulation. This is something that is worth dissecting, I think, this kind of issue. So the idea that a man is being a creep, and it's not confronted directly, that it's kind of indirectly dealt with. I mean, I would say that the female equivalent of a man being a creep is being manipulative, and manipulative on the level of social etiquette and such, and so okay, I'm not explaining this that well, but because women are too attuned to not losing sorry, my handwriting is so bad. Oh, sorry. Because women are not too attuned to laying down their own boundaries or risking any potential losses or missed out benefits of association, it is better to act and it is better to act with or in some sense actually have or contend no boundaries, and then play off the social levers that present themselves, keeping their options open, maximizing the female privilege, and culture has to conform to some matrix of stereotypes that effectively infantilize the position that caused, so now men need to kind of read the tea leaves and the signs of all the things that might discomfort a woman, and you have to kind of somehow get affirmative consent on each of those possible and potential possibilities constantly. I mean, this is essentially why some men are clever to say, I will have no private interaction, because it's just too dangerous. There must be a witness in the vicinity, because, there's no telling what you might be accused of. But essentially, that kind of idea that people must be sensitive preemptively, instead of having the onus on the woman to lay down boundaries, that essentially expectation of infantilism is what opens the door to the authoritarian fascist solution, which then just gives them their place and says, no, this is your role then. Because essentially you cannot have this growing sensitivity that has to be self-policed, or so this is the contrast, is that the authoritarian fascist and the social justice warrior person, they both have the same definition of the problem. They just are on the other side of the coin in terms of the solution. So the social justice person thinks that we can tell the perpetrators of the world, we can re-educate them, we can retrain them, and then but that actually is not even true, because the problem is not even with the perpetrator. It's like if there is not agreeing with their ideological presuppositions, but the thing that they actually need to fix is a kind of ongoing process of an ongoing source of the problem, let's just say, which they have no way of ever touching with their superficial moral code. And so re-educating the perpetrator is essentially is impossible, because even though that they might be able to, first of all, how would you enforce it? You have to have some kind of complete surveillance state. You would have to violate every, right of privacy or something like that, and even if you did that, the victims of the or the complainers against this sort of behavior would not be happy, because they would have literally neutered the kind of interaction which they actually, because essentially they're the codependents, or they are. It's quite ironic, but almost through this ideology, they are often setting up the vulnerability. They want to absorb some real world damage so that they can use the ideology sadistically. So in some sense, they are just walking into these pre-set up manipulative conventions that, it's so easy essentially to set up these narratives, because that's essentially what they are. They're like the American legal system when they have torts. So they've got this kind of and this is my fundamental problem with, for example, the American system, is that yes, it's based on a kind of plenary power that the legislature is defining the civil wrong, and that is not what it should be. It should be a general principle. The substantive law should develop organically, and it should not be based on some kind of democratic, so in that sense, the state itself is fundamentally liberal, and I mean that in the original sense. and therefore it is subject to the problem within mankind itself in its ability to be inconsistent. Um, and the law does not have the implementer self-correct at that point. Well, it does through the jury in some sense, but then you end up, I mean, you'll have to at some point be making very sophisticated, almost ideological defenses. And then you make yourself prone to this level of perniciousness. And so I would say that there is a fundamental legal problem. This lends nothing to the social justice people. I'm just basically saying that there are elements of the perniciousness in this form of thinking that have been baked into some forms of government. In fact, most forms of Western government even. The only one that escapes that is the only surviving remnant of the Roman legal system, which was the best legal system in the world and still is in the form that it remains, which is the Roman Dutch substantive law, which is still properly preserved within the constitutional order, although de facto it's essentially it's not running as it should. I mean, the rule of law is not respected. South Africa is, in terms of its own violation of its own precepts, it is a banana republic, sadly. The executive effectively makes all the law, and it doesn't even do it through Parliament. I mean, literally, Parliament has made itself largely redundant, and in fact, when it's even set up a constitutional review effectively to sanitize the Constitution of its non-racialism, and I mean, that in itself is just so offensive to anyway, I'm not going to get into that particular quagmire, but that itself is actually a sophisticated critique that's not easy to just mouth off. But sorry, I get into horrible tangents. But I think this is an important point. That because there is this intrinsic hypocrisy in saying that one person is the perpetrator and one person is the victim, which the ideology, essentially what the ideology promises to do is it promises to invert that position. And so it almost gives, to the extent at which the ideology respects you as the victim, you get to disrespect the perpetrator. And, it has this really simplistic symmetry within it. And because, I mean, that's why it's so popular, is because it's so convenient. It's you don't have to understand anything about reality. You don't have to understand anything about complicated issues. You don't have to look into layers of things. You just reduce the terms into the superficial moral code, and you basically shout at anyone hysterically who doesn't conform to this kind of groupthink consensus. But anyway, so under what is really happening there is that in all of that you're insulating a conception of the problem, which is effectively the same conceptualization of the world that the fascists have. So that really is why Hitler called them useful idiots, is because they spread fascistic values and they enforce an orthodoxy of conceptualizing problems as according to the fascistic worldview. They are intrinsically authoritarian. They don't see that about themselves because essentially they still think that the solution is to educate the perpetrator into falling into the sympathy program, that this kind of this group shame and guilt complex, and And even that, it's hard to sustain this level of hyperrealism and surrealism and delusion, but it becomes all the more possible once you've even deprived people of a kind of just the humanity of seeing the opposite sex as a real person. So the opposite sex essentially becomes a bulwark of a kind of opposing faction. And so when you've got male and female as opposed political entities, then it becomes so much easier to regress and essentially reduce race relations into a weird system of token representation of group experiences that have to be amalgamated, and everyone has to retrieve their integrity from that labeled identity, which then gets filled in by these oh so sophisticated grand wizards of academia that will tell you all about your history, and the history of your blackness and your black spirit, or whatever it may be. It essentially is, so they essentially use history instead of genetic stuff. So, the fascists will talk about the gene stuff. Now they've essentially just replaced that with something that is just as functionally powerful, essentially. Yeah, I mean, I do think perhaps that maybe it isn't as powerful, and maybe that is why there hasn't been a genocide yet. Maybe that is why no, they could have had a genocide already. We have been very lucky in South Africa that we had a water crisis, and we had Obama giving a speech, and we had the electricity crisis. And I think all of those things have been very good at diffusing the waves of propaganda and the political talk radio people that have been drumming up the identity politics hate machine, and have been really trying to generate the kind of feeling that genocide would be justifiable. Eusebius Makaiser being the most overt example of this, openly asking the question, or not even asking the question, answering the question that, in his own words, if there was a genocide in this country, people would not say that it wasn't unjustified. Kind of echoing that they have this general sense of kind of, the liberals of the West would understand if there was a genocide. Just as Hitler had that sense of appeasement, that the fascists in this country should feel the same kind of allowances that Hitler felt. And their only justification is that we have cultural power right now, so obviously we should all be burning the constitution together and rebranding South Africa as a parliamentary democracy instead of a constitutional democracy that it is. And never mind actually examining the contents of that constitution and seeing how blatantly it is violated, and how blatantly it is misread and interpreted as if it includes something about the social justice. I mean, it uses the word social justice. It means the exact opposite of what social justice warriors refer to when they talk about social justice. I mean, it's literally disgusting. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that, but sadly, I veered off some of the points that I was trying to make. But yeah, the thing about the creep, uh, and at least the moment the Joe Biden kind of story, I think is a wonderful example of this. Um, how women that choose not to um, vocalize boundaries and directly place boundaries, then indirectly rely on those boundaries through a kind of device of ideological sympathy that they should be owed because they are not privileged in some way. So, that is the first claim, is that, well, I was dealing with someone with privilege and I don't have privilege. So that is the underlining distinction that allows me essentially to have my cake and eat it. Never mind that I'm actually exercising a tremendous amount of privilege, ideological privilege, in being able to tactically deploy this information at the best time possible. And essentially, in the meantime, before I did this, got to reap all the ongoing potential benefits of continuing the association. So it's this kind of this maximum sense of maximizing opportunity, which is directly consequential of not laying down boundaries. And so women live in this very strange, almost quantum many world universe where they get to, because of the ideological privilege of being able to complain about privilege, they get to kind of simulate multiple different courses flowing from some incident or something that they complain about. And then they get to kind of take all the possible different courses that might have been open to them and different routes that they might have taken or not have taken. And they get to cherry pick the benefits of each particular course of action, and they get to kind of claim that. And the problem is that when you do that, you actually claim much more than each one of than perhaps any of the best of those. And so the real work and overcoming real obstacles never gets done. And there's no authentic movement, because essentially that would also require a different ideological stance, which would essentially be non-racialism, which actually lets you build from reality and build with real materials and actually create something permanent and sustainable, instead of just always taking the convenient shortcuts, which is essentially, because you try to have your cake and eat it, it's a weird phrase, I guess, to have your cake and eat it. But because there is the kind of table thumping that the victim of privilege or the complainer of being unsafe, and that safety being an issue that is generated because someone is privileged and someone is not privileged, essentially becomes the useless distinction that allows corruption to continue ad nauseum, infinitum, because under that fuzzy logic and that fudged set of moral standards, you can contrive and extract and exploit through this ideological free good that potentially offers you some freedom for nothing but for just imposing justice on the perpetrator. But the problem is that no perpetrator will actually have the resources to deliver what it is that you're claiming from him or her. And so, you end up with an indictment to rob the bank of white guilt. And then when you realize that the balance is actually measly and essentially practically empty because of the dysfunction that has infected and destabilized institutional integrity, you end up robbing a fictional bank that holds nothing. And so you have to extract blood instead. You have to that failure itself leads you to lead a war against the world, essentially, as fascism always has to. It has to grow its antagonism, because that is the only way that it can supplement its own failure, because it only has an abstract solution, and it, in fact, the only thing that it promises to treat and to encourage and help is the identity itself, which is not the people who think the identity pertains to. And that promise only works when you don't have power. The more that the people who have this ideology have power, the more it's obviously a corrupted enterprise. Because by the ideology itself, you can only give someone a benefit because they are a token, not because it's somewhat appropriate to do so through some kind of rule of law, that you've set out a general formula that is meant to actually work in an integrated way with things that are functional. No, you have to redistribute in such a way so as to give to people that would otherwise never have something, or you have to lower standards and increase entry to things, instead of finding a way to find people that are appropriate candidates and give them extra resources in order so that they meet the standard. Instead, you're going to have two sets of standards, which essentially undercut the whole ability of the system to even comprehend its own level of development and what is perhaps an obstacle. Said you're going to muddy all those waters by essentially having a set of double standards, which are going to so pervasively enforce upon everyone to respect that you're going to destroy the notion of respect and integrity itself, and that you're going to have to invent hate law, hate speech codes in order to prop up and perpetuate this system of hollow, essentially a politically infused culture that more and more resembles a fascistic and totalitarian and authoritarian landscape. It's worth pointing out as well that apartheid also made the executive essentially write and contrive all of the legislature, which was essentially just rubber stamped by Parliament. Anyway.